Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here to make a presentation to you on behalf of the World Bank Group and the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. And I'd like to start by just saying a few words about why is the World Bank involved in some of this kind of work. We make significant investments in national meteorological and hydrological services, currently approximately $500 million US, to try to improve the capability of those services, primarily to improve climate resilience in countries, and in the weakest countries, the weakest developing countries. And as we have started making those investments, mostly over the last 10 years or so, we found that despite the improvements in the capacity to provide weather forecasts, climate forecasts, hydrological predictions, we still have a large loss of life and a lack of understanding of what to do with the weather forecast. So my talk is going to focus on what are the issues behind essentially the fact that we can provide good forecasts today, but we still have bad outcomes. And what are we trying to do to actually, interesting renumbering of my slide, but to look at how we're actually trying to take technical information about the forecast, about warnings, and how we translate that information into the impacts. So the focus, as we call it, is on impact forecasting. And I'll step through some of the mechanisms about reducing disasters, and this idea of it's not what the weather will be, but what the weather will do. And we could say what the climate will be, what the climate will do. It's to understand the impact of that and how to develop these kinds of services. I'd like to start by talking a little bit through a number of case studies about what some of the primary issues are, what causes effectively a hazard to become a human disaster. There's no reason why most of the natural hazards that we face have to be disasters, but they are for a number of important reasons. So let's look at, first of all, a case study of the Philippines, Yolande or Haiyan from last year. A well forecast, at least 5 days in advance, Category 5 tropical cyclone. Pagasa, the National Meteorological Service, provided good warnings. The government responded with evacuation orders in time, but more than 6,000 people died and more than 28,000 people were injured. And the total economic loss around 2 billion. A huge disaster. Good track forecasts, good intensity forecasts. Warnings were issued at provincial levels. Government was engaged and committed to taking action. Relatively good coordination. The Weather Service was embedded in the Emergency Management Organization. There are good policies, there are good laws, all these things exist. First responders were in place, but people didn't actually understand the warning. It didn't trigger the appropriate actions to save lives. For example, the risk of storm surge. There was confusion about whether it was a tsunami or a storm surge. And you think about that, you say, well, why does it matter? From an emergency response point of view, if you are living in a coastal environment, you'll drown whether it's a storm surge or whether it's a tsunami. The important thing is to respond to the warning. But people were confused. And it took, because the inundation with a storm surge was about 1 to 2 kilometers inland, people were responding very late. It was already very poor weather. It was almost impossible to evacuate to safer areas. And much of the infrastructure, or some of the shelters, people actually drowned in the shelters because of the shelters were poorly located. So this is a fundamental problem that we face. We're trying to improve forecasting, we're trying to improve warning services, but they still lead to very poor outcomes. So currently, and in the case of the Philippines, there was a lack of scientific and technical capacity to translate the hazard information. A good forecast should lead to a better outcome, but it didn't, because people didn't understand how to translate this into impacts, and therefore underestimate the impacts. They didn't appreciate or utilize available hazard information. There's a lot of information in many countries that's available that is basically not being used, and particularly in the case of Haiyan, information about the risk of severe storm surges. The second case is a case in India, also from last year, in the state of Uttarakhand in northern India. In that case, in June 2013, there was a multi-day convective event which produced extremely heavy rains, caused devastating floods and landslides. 375% above normal monsoon rainfall fell in 3 days. It was another storm, a system that produced more than 5,000, nearly 6,000 fatalities, even more, because the number of people actually lost has never actually been fully accounted for. 4,200 villages affected. And we as a bank team went to visit this year, in March of this year, to try to help the state understand what the problem was. And one of the towns in the very northern part up in the Himalayas, Kedarnath. On the left is a picture of the town before and after. Basically, the entire town was washed out. This is a village that is in a valley, in which actually moving to high ground is not very far. It's a few hundred meters to go from the area inundated by the flood to an area of safety. Yet many people from here lost their lives. So what worked and what didn't here? In this case, we had, again, good weather forecasts of heavy rain 3 days ahead of the event. So far ahead that was actually published in the newspapers. So you can't say there weren't warnings. But the response from the vice chairman of the National Disaster Management Agency said, and you can read this as I'm speaking, that despite the fact that they have the bulletin, they didn't understand how to interpret what the technical expression from the Met Service was about heavy rain. It seems obvious from a meteorological point of view. Heavy rain throughout the state means that where you have the risk of flooding, you'll have floods. Where the rivers are, it will flood. Yet, those areas were not properly warned, and people who could have been saved lost their lives. And unfortunately, one of the other parts that is also important, as I'll mention a little later in the talk, it's not just about the technical forecast, it's also about the jurisdiction. Let's blame the Indian Meteorological Department for a poor forecast. No, the Indian Meteorological Department gave a very good forecast. The response was inadequate in terms of emergency management, but in a way, it's just the whole system was incapable of taking the appropriate action despite having good information. And one of the multiple hazard effects of it was also because there was a late response to the disaster. More people lost their lives. The emergency services, people in the emergency services in the Indian Air Force lost their lives because of helicopter crashes in bad weather trying to rescue people. A big problem here is that the models were not coupled together, so it wasn't coupling the weather information to what the impact might be. The hazard models, the knock-on effect of the weather, the cascading effect of the weather. Again, similar to the Philippines, there was a lack of ability to translate the hazard information into impacts. What are the impacts? When we say heavy rain, what does that actually mean? Poor communication, lack of appreciation and utilization of hazard maps. So throughout the state of Uttarakhand, we were shown published maps of vulnerability to landslides. But this information is simply put into a map, it's put into a book, it's put on a shelf. It's not actually used in any meaningful way in this sort of situation. Closer to home, in China, this time last year, tropical cyclone Fitao hit the Chinese mainland, and in particular, since I live and work part of the time in Shanghai, it hit Shanghai. Shanghai is as part of the China Meteorological Administration, the Shanghai Meteorological Service is second to none in its provision of forecasts. It provides extremely good meteorological forecasts and warnings. But nevertheless, there was a huge flood that caused a massive amount of damage and impact and disruption to a city of 25 million people, and somewhere around $5 billion in losses as a result of that. The question is why? We have good weather forecasts, highly developed multi-hazard warning system, well-prepared emergency management and first response, really good public communication. It has all the things that are missing in places like the Philippines and northern India. Good rules and regulations for warnings and response. We know what we're supposed to do. Good standard operating procedures. More than 18 million people were alerted, but the weather warnings were issued solely on weather criteria. The high level of alert, therefore, was tied to when we would expect to have the highest winds and the highest rainfall, which happened to occur in the middle of rush hour in the morning, too late to take effective action. So from an emergency response point of view, from the disaster management perspective, the warnings were too late. Actually, the warnings from a technical point of view were effectively perfect. They were too late because there was no time to take effective action. Many people were trapped on the roads. One intersection, people spent 4 hours stuck in vehicles with floodwaters rising. No regulation was in place to actually permit children to stay home from school. That subsequently has changed in an analysis of the situation. Again, inadequate translation of hazard information into impacts. People don't understand what to do with the information. And this is applicable. I'm using weather examples, and I use it, we can look at this from the perspective of increasing amount of extremes of weather under changing climate scenarios, but we can also see this purely from a climate point of view also. We don't know how to translate the hazard information, whether it's climate, whether it's meteorological, weather related, whether it's hydrological, or whether it's a geophysical hazard, into what the impact is actually going to be. And this is something that I will now talk about. How are we thinking about changing our way of coping with this sort of problem? So what are the coping mechanisms to reduce disasters? From the bank point of view, we're dealing with effectively 3 different components. We think about early warning, but we also think about how do we transfer risk, and we use financial mechanisms to transfer risk. How do we improve the way we can create insurance structure, or financial structures such as insurance, to reduce the risk? It's one thing to warn, and you can get people out of harm's way, but you still risk losing property. And if you can't recover because you don't have any resources, you further have a cascading hazard problem to society, which you can avoid if you can actually make financial transfer mechanisms readily available. And I'll talk a little bit about that. That's not the focus of this. The other is resilient infrastructure. If there are shelters, it's important that those shelters are sufficiently sound to provide protection. If I'm going to leave my home, I have to have somewhere to go that's safe. Or ideally, we build infrastructure in which we live in those environments which are safe, but I have to know then to get home to be safe. I therefore need the early warning. These things are all have to fit together. Let's think a little bit about when we talk about dealing with risk transfer. What do we need to actually determine that? How do we actually create a financial mechanism? We basically need historical information about hazards, the geophysical drivers. We put that together with vulnerability assessments, information about the social, economical, and physical conditions in which people live, and to a lesser extent, because it's harder to capture it, but specific information about the people and assets. So there are a lot of studies that have been supported by our program and by others, which are looking at gathering vulnerability information. And we've done this now in the Western Pacific, where down to every single house in the Pacific Islands has been assessed in terms of its vulnerability, using a combination of in situ observation and a lot of space-based assessment. So with that information, it's possible to then figure out what the likely damages are going to be based on the history of the particular meteorological hazard, tropical cyclones in particular, and what the likely losses are going to be, and then determine how to actually insure against those losses to provide a mechanism for transferring that risk. Now that has been done completely independently of any thought about information to improve forecasting. And we've started to realize if somebody has collected all of this vulnerability data, this vulnerability assessments, instead of looking at the geophysical hazard from a historical point of view, let's look at it now from a forecast point of view. Let's actually think about this as the database on vulnerability can be combined actually with real-time information on exposure, on the exposure of individuals, combined with forecasts of the hazard, so say a tropical cyclone forecast. We can forecast then not just the weather, but we can start to think about forecasting and warning of the expected damage, and forecasting and warning of the expected losses, the predicted impacts. And the response then will reduce the risk, and we would expect that ideally, people who are informed about what the impact is going to be, is most likely to be, will take much more effective action than if they're told the wind speed will be 60 knots. So an example that many of us are familiar with in meteorology, we provide a forecast. We provide a tropical cyclone forecast that says the winds will exceed 60 knots in so many hours from now. And colleagues, for example, in the states of Tonga, in the Kingdom of Tonga, they were issuing warnings earlier this year for tropical cyclone Ian, which hit their outer islands. And the Met Service and the government officials went to visit some of the places hardest hit, and they asked the local population, so did you receive the warning? Yes, we received the warning. When did you evacuate? I evacuated when my house fell down. And this is the problem that we're trying to overcome, is that we have to translate this into an information that says if 60 knot winds means your house will fall down, it will fall down based on our forecast at a particular time, evacuate well in advance of that. Because you're putting these people in harm's way by people are putting themselves in harm's way by not taking early enough action. So that leads us to the focus on not what the weather will be, but what the weather will do. So we think about the hazard itself, we think about the vulnerability assessment, and then we think about the tools to translate, put that information together, the vulnerability exposure information, the hazard information, into a tool that basically is about conveying risk to people. So we look at these things together, and we basically are then in a position where we can forecast impacts. The meteorological community, and particularly the operational community, are very sensitive to their mission expanding beyond providing weather forecasts. This is a pushback particularly from smaller weather services. They have a hard enough time providing their basic meteorological forecasts, their climate outlooks and so forth. And now we're saying, but that's not enough, you should do more. But if we partner with agencies which are actually providing vulnerability information, at the first step, at least we can understand what the basis of what the risk of the impact will be based on what we call impact-based forecast. That is not considering specific exposure. But ideally, if we can consider what the individual needs, if an individual in a society like here where everybody's got their smartphone, your forecast is actually, your warning is a personal warning to you with information that you provide about your vulnerability, your exposure to the system, and the system can provide a targeted forecast. That's the goal of the community ultimately. Now, we're not there, but one day we will hopefully have that level of detail in our forecasts, whether it's applicable to the individual from a disaster management point of view, or whether it's to a sector, whether it's in agriculture or other sectors of the economy. I want to give an example from the UK. It probably is not so easy to see this in any detail, but the idea here is that we have had, this doesn't show the weather forecast, but the weather forecast for this time actually has the highest winds to the southwest of England, so the bottom left-hand side. And this is for the time 0 Zulu to 9. And it's for a forecast of the risk of overturning vehicles. This is coming from the Meteorological Service, from the Met Office. It shows that the risk is highest in the circular road around London, and it's because of the high volume of traffic, and it's because of the particular road system that exists in that part of the world, even though a meteorological forecast would have put the highest winds in the western part of the country, southwestern part of the country, not around London. So it's a good example that the highest risk of impact is not directly coupled to the highest meteorological condition. And this is the start of a system in which now forecasters are forecasting the risk of a particular event to those most affected, rather than producing just a meteorological forecast. How does it work? Ultimately, the idea is that we would normally have a meteorological service providing the forecast. It would provide early briefing to stakeholders, provide response to government, response to the public through warning services. But now we add this step in which we're looking at the impact of that forecast. In the UK, this is done in the following way, where we, along the x-axis, we have the likelihood of the impact increasing from green, which is no impact, to red, which is high impact, and the likelihood on the y-axis from very low to very high. So if we know that for a particular event that there is going to be a very high impact, even though there's a low likelihood, we'll start to issue a more higher level of warning, in this case an orange alert. Whereas if we were simply looking at this from a meteorological point of view, we may not identify that. So if we think back now to the situation with Tropical Cyclone Fito, so we had a yellow alert issued on October the 7th, 2013. And if we had focused only on a hazard, we would have produced an alert like that. We would have we did take preventative measures, so emergency services were prepared, but no action was taken by anybody. If we had an impact warning, it would have either been an orange or red alert issued at the same time, And it would have focused on the likely forecast impact and disruption to the traffic, the risk of safety to drivers, passengers due to flooding the following morning during rush hour. Rush hour would have identified the event as the significant high impact time. Emergency response would have then been mobilized much earlier, closing roads that were liable to flooding, rerouting traffic, issuing alerts, and getting people to stay home. The benefit is basically of impact. By providing impact forecasts and warnings, relay a much greater message of greater relevance to enable those to take appropriate actions to mitigate the overall adverse effects of the hydrometeorological hazards. So it's a big step forward than dealing just with hydrometeorological forecasts or warning. How do we get there? How do we develop these impact and warning services? One very important step is that this is not something that can be done by a meteorological service on its own. It's something that requires a partnership between many, many different organizations, all of whom have different sources of data. It's been difficult enough in some countries, including my own, the UK, to get the Met Service to work with the Hydrological Agency to provide a flood forecast. It took till 2011 before flood forecasting was actually really properly developed in the UK. And what we're asking for now is a much, much greater level of cooperation between mapping agencies, between the road agencies responsible for roads, bridges, all those who have vulnerable infrastructure, and all those who have different sources of data that can provide input into the vulnerability and exposure and provide a much more precise, or provide the opportunity to calculate what the impact of the hazards will be. They need to develop these services. We have to have some common criteria for impact forecasts, for risk transfer and resilience infrastructure. Those three points in the circle of early warning, capacity to provide risk transfer mechanisms and resilient infrastructure. These cannot be done in isolation. You cannot focus on one at the expense of the other. There is a move afoot to focus more on resilience infrastructure at the expense of early warning. So we can have resilient infrastructure, but if people are not within that resilient infrastructure when there's a disaster or a hazard impacts, they're exposed. And we need to understand that this balance is needed between these different components. If we don't have a financial mechanism in place to provide risk transfer, we also don't have the ability to recover when we damage the infrastructure, and we can produce more a cascading effect of hazard impacts. We need to share a lot of data, and this has been a difficult area in most countries, and has been a problem here where the road agencies have not been willing to share information necessarily. They consider it to be, in a way, classified information. But once you have, and you can see the potential impact, you then realize that this information is so valuable in terms of increasing the resilience of your society, then it's worth sharing. Advances in telecommunication is really also very important, and as I mentioned at the beginning, that we focus on investment in developing countries and least developed countries, and one of the huge advances in all of the countries that we work with is telecommunication. One major step forward, that they have wireless communication and in many cases smartphone technology. So it means that we can really improve the kinds of services that are provided even in some of the poorest countries, because we already have the telecommunication infrastructure in place. So finally, this is my last slide. I just want to reiterate some of the main points, is that this focus on impact forecasting is very complex, and it requires a lot of planning and involvement at many levels. I mentioned the number of agencies involved. For example, that picture from the UK, I think it was somewhere around 18 agencies have to work together to provide this sorts of level of warning services. And it's not an easy option from the production side, from the producer of these kinds of warning information. But from the user side, it's much simpler. The type of information that can be shared is something that people basically understand. A very difficult and critical element of getting there is building the partnerships between the national meteorological and hydrological services, disaster management agencies, the media and other government departments and users to acquire the relevant data. If we ultimately have an impact warning that's a personalized service, it means that users are intimately involved in sharing information that can give them the kind of warning information that they can use. And probably ultimately the best way of getting to the last mile, actually, to providing the tools in people's hands to reduce their risk. The training is a hugely important area, and as noted here, this is an institution which has the WMO Training Center, and I hope that we'll see in the next few years the capacity and leadership of organizations like this to be able to actually move beyond the standard kinds of training that we're providing to meteorologists to improve forecasts of weather and climate, but to be able to provide this impact kind of services and to really figure out how to build those kinds of training programs that are needed. And finally, to also recognize that without public engagement, this doesn't work. You really have to focus a lot more on the education and training within the public to understand how to use information. But it will be information that is much easier to understand than the current response to warnings of meteorological events and hydrological events. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lopez. It was a very impressive talk about the very challenging topic. So is there any questions from the floor or comments?